the way as a reporter ended up haunting me for decades to come. And that was Judy Singer. And as Anne mentioned, she wasn't scary when I first met her. She didn't seem so scary back in 1981. Back then, she was an upper middle class mother of three who wore a single strand of pearls and kitten heels. And she reminded me more of anything than of my mother, with whom I was really close.
I know. I tried to get it to turn. Oh, wait, here we go.
I should have helped you with that.
There we go. Hang on, there we go.
My mother was a very beautiful, very elegant lady who had a lot in common with Judy Singer. They were both 19 when they dropped out of school to get married, and they made their children their life's work. But the similarities, oh, and they both, of course, worked for Hadassah as volunteers. But that's the resemblance was certainly part of the reason I was so drawn to Judy. But it ended completely when Judy was arrested and convicted later of orchestrating the murder of her ex-husband, Howard. And here Judy is with her pearls and her son, Daniel, her firstborn. She called him the little Messiah. This is how very, she was very identified with her Judaism and being a Jewish mother and being a wonderful Jewish mother. That was her image when I first met her. When I first met her, she was not charged with any crime. But 11 years after I met her in 1991, that was when she was arrested. And by then, my life had already become entangled with hers for a reason that I explain in the book and I'm happy to talk about later. But I'll tell you that over the next 25 years, I visited Judy in prison. We became almost friendly. She sent me cards for Rosh Hashanah. But I started gradually to feel, oh, there she is when she got released, actually, just last year. But along the way, I started to feel like Clarice Sterling to her Hannibal Lecter as I found out more about her. Anyway, she was released at the age of 73. She's now living in Fresno, out here in California, and she still hasn't admitted her guilt in the murder or a motive. But what prosecutors said was that they'd suspected that her motive was that she thought she was protecting her children from her ex-husband, who was their father. I've authored and co-authored 10 nonfiction books along the way. As I was interested in this book, I got my first contract in 1991, but this book was the hardest book that I've ever had to try to write. All books are somewhat hard to write, for me at least, but this one was nearly impossible, and I almost gave up on it several times. But I got the contract in 1991, and it ended up being canceled in 1995. But I would keep going back to it on weekends. I would do an interview or I would do some work on it. I knew I had great material because every time I'd go out to dinner with my husband, every time I met somebody new practically, I'd end up telling the story. And they would always say, you've got to write it. You've got to write this book. And for some reason, it was just really, really hard to tell. I knew it was like the materials I knew was compelling. That everybody loves a Black widow, and Judy was this very interesting character that wasn't at all what she seemed. And then the prosecutor was a wonderful character for a prosecutor. He was a former rodeo champion who had a drawl and a silver trophy belt. I mean, he was just classic. And the two assassins that were hired in the murder were also just incredible characters. It was as if they were cast by the Coen brothers. The trigger man, was a 19-year-old laid off department store clerk who'd never shot anything other than pheasants in his life before he shot Howard Whitkin. And to steal his nerves, he took 5 microdot hits of LSD and was shooting blindly with his eyes closed. It was kind of a wonder that he ever actually ended up committing the crime. And I mean, along the way, they drove from Flint, Michigan to California to do this thing. They were paid like $10,000. And at first they actually forgot to buy ammunition, and they drove their car into a ditch and they got lost. I mean, they were really almost, if it wasn't so tragic, they would have been really goofy characters. So I'd be telling these stories and people would be saying, you have to write this book, you have to finish this book. And I really had almost a psychological problem in telling it. I tried to write it as straight true crime. And I think I had some feelings about Judy and about my own family that were really getting in the way, and that for some reason I had to work them out. And that's why the book ended up being this hybrid of memoir and true crime, because I started getting kind of fascinated about why I was so obsessed with this murder story. What was it that drew me to it? And I think it was a lot because I was I came upon this story at a time when I was struggling to break away from my own family, which in its own way, not that much, but was dysfunctional. And I associated Judy with my mother, who I loved so much, but also really needed to separate from. And I had to work those things out and had to figure those things out before I could really understand what was worth telling about the true crime story, which was fascinating in itself. Anyway, as I was saying before, the book has a lot of different themes, from narcissism to relationships between Jewish mothers and their daughters to just the way some people are able to lie so easily and live very false lives. So I hope we'll get into some of that during the questions. But I have a sample reading, a chapter that I boiled down to read to you. So I will do that now. And then I'd really look forward to hearing your questions and having a discussion. Anyway, I excerpted a chapter that is part of the memoir, part of the book, that talks about what it was like to be 22 years old and completely blind. And I'm hoping that some of you will be able to remember back to that time and understand. I had to develop some compassion for the kind of jerky person that I was. Anyway, during the week that Howard Whitkin was murdered, I was 22 years old and traveling in the Himalayan mountains of northern Pakistan, trailing after a man I thought I loved. I felt like Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca as Richard and I hopped aboard small planes and checked into five-star hotels. After all those years of studying and work, the life I dreamed of, or at least a close facsimile, was finally beginning. This wasn't exactly what I'd planned when I landed in London 2 months earlier. Back then, I thought I'd have the leading role. Newsweek magazine had just hired me for an elite internship, with my expenses and salary paid by a grant from the Overseas Press Club. But that was before I met Richard, whom I'd idolized for years. Just 7 years older than I was, he already was a legendary foreign correspondent, covering the Middle East and Africa for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'd first read his dispatches as a college senior in 1979, after he won a Pulitzer Prize for his Middle East coverage. Anyone who could write like that had to have a huge heart, I figured, not to mention a lot to teach me. So when the Newsweek editor who hired me in New York remarked that Richard was his friend, I asked for an introduction. Maybe Richard needs someone to house sit when he's traveling, I suggested. That would help me save on rent so I could make the grant last longer. The editor agreed, and he called Richard in London, after which Richard called me. In my first week in the city, we met at a bar near Earl's Court, where skinny, dreadlocked Rastafarians leaned against brick walls, drinking from cans and paper bags, and men in turbans played Arabic music on boomboxes. Richard sat grinning and smoking a cigar. Within the first 5 minutes, I blurted out how much I admired him and proposed my house-sitting idea. That could work, he said, while for a shadow of an instant his eyes dropped towards my breasts, presented that day in a tight purple cashmere sweater. My mother had given me that sweater, together with the seeds of my ridiculous confusion. In that moment, I couldn't have said if I wanted Richard to mentor or to marry me, which maybe wasn't so surprising after all those years of her mixed messages. Like, for instance, "You're smart enough to be free and independent," and don't be too smart or no one will protect you. And mothers are virtuous. Career women are selfish. And for God's sake, use my bitter sacrifice to make something more of your life. At that very first meeting, Richard gave me an extra set of keys to his flat. Within a few weeks, I was not only house sitting when he was away, but hanging around on his return, sleeping in his spare room, cooking meals, and running his errands. All the while, I flirted like the clumsy amateur I was, growing increasingly frustrated as he failed to reveal anything beyond that first flicker of interest. The more remote he seemed, the more I longed to get closer. I had a spy at Newsweek's office back in New York, where Richard occasionally dropped by on his US visits to see his friend, my editor. Sarah was the editor's secretary, with whom I'd struck up a conspiratorial friendship. When I called her from the London office to tell her about my crush on Richard, she warned me to be careful. He's got a lot of girlfriends, she said. We groused together about how unfair that was. Richard was paunchy and reeked of tobacco with thinning hair he never combed. None of it diminished his attractiveness. Women like me wanted to take care of him. I thought I had my chance one night after Richard arrived home late from Rhodesia, and we stayed up talking until dawn. He told me all about his adventures on the road, including how he'd covered the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon by walking across the no man's land between Palestinian guerrillas and the Israeli army. And I asked his advice about stories I was working on for Newsweek. But although I smiled and smiled at him, he didn't make a move. This is hopeless, I thought, as I stumbled into his spare room, closing the curtains against the morning light. I'd yet to learn the secret of how to catch a man. I woke just after 9 in the morning to find the flat empty. A scribbled note on the kitchen table informed me that Richard had gone off to cover some breaking news in Tel Aviv. I dressed in a rush, took the underground to the bureau, and within an hour was sitting at my little corner desk, reading a newspaper and silently berating myself when I heard the bureau chief secretary gasp. "Look what someone got for you," she trilled, looking over at me. I glanced up to see a delivery man heading out the door, and on her desk a giant flamboyant bouquet of pink lilies. A few days later, on Richard's next stop home, I was waiting for him at the apartment, having splurged on a couple of steaks to go with a bottle from his stash of Bordeaux. I put a vase of roses on the table and wore a tight, low-cut burgundy dress. This time it did the trick. After that, Richard readily took on the role of a teacher to a worshipful student. I admired his ability to ignore a ringing phone when he didn't feel like answering it. He also showed me how to make strong coffee with a French press, his ritual before sitting down to write, and which became my ritual as well. The French novelist Honoré de Balzac once wrote that coffee was a great power in my life, sending sparks shooting into his brain. Ideas quick march into motions like battalions of a grand army to its legendary fighting ground, he wrote. Memories charge in, bright flags on high. The cavalry of metaphor deploys with magnificent gallop. Balzac drank stronger and stronger coffee until he died at 51, his stomach destroyed by his addiction. From my perspective at 22, it didn't seem like such a bad trade. Making love with Richard was another kind of trade. It didn't send sparks shooting into my brain, but I hadn't expected it to. I'd lost my virginity in the summer of my 18th year to the head peach picker on an Israeli kibbutz, and his wham bam shalom approach had set a low bar. And as for me, I wasn't only amateur at flirting. What I loved most of all was being with Richard afterwards as I listened to his stories. I pestered him for details about his years of paying dues while covering local politics in Baltimore and Philadelphia. His bottom line was always the same. To follow his path, I'd have to return to the United States and pay my dues on a local beat at a small paper. I didn't want to think about that then. With Richard, I was at least living my dream vicariously, and maybe that was as close as I'd get. The Newsweek internship had been a disappointment. From the start, the bureau chief was not enthusiastic about mentoring a cub and had left me to my own devices, rustling up stories as best I could. Occasionally, the magazine would print one, but on balance, I didn't feel like I had that much to lose on the night that Richard called to suggest I accompany him the very next day on a 2-week trip to Pakistan, where he planned to report on the US-backed Mujahideen rebels fighting against the occupying Soviet army in neighboring Afghanistan. I left a giddy message on the bureau chief's phone to let him know I'd be gone for a while. In Islamabad, at the Intercontinental Hotel, Richard and I spent late afternoons sitting by the pool and evenings chatting with diplomats or sipping whiskey together in the hotel's permit room for infidel guests. Traveling west, we strolled through the souk in Peshawar, dodging water buffaloes and honking Vespas. Shepherding me through the stalls with his hand against my back, he bought me kohl eyeliner in a little silver case, soft Egyptian striped cotton pajamas, a leather purse, and a large lapis pendant. I took notes for him and snapped a photo that got me a byline credit in the Inquirer. He invited me to sit in on his interviews, introducing me as his assistant. He taught me how to use a teletype machine and charged all my meals to his expense account. I listened closely, studying his technique, the friendly, open way he got his sources to talk to him. Then one night, during a special candlelight dinner he'd arranged on our hotel rooftop, given as he was to grand gestures at his newspaper's expense, Richard caught me by surprise, telling me that meeting me had led him to an orgy of bridge burnings. I assumed this was a reference to all those other girlfriends. I can see us maybe getting married someday, maybe having some babies, he added. Babies! I stifled a gasp. Being with Richard felt like being at the center of the universe, the only place where interesting things were happening, the only place I wanted to be. But I didn't want to think about babies. Having babies would kill my career, condemning me to live my mother's life. So I didn't answer his indirect question. Instead, I fluttered my kohl-enhanced eyelashes as I suddenly remembered what I'd been meaning to tell him all day. That morning, while still in Peshawar, I'd had a long and promising conversation with the United Nations head of refugee affairs. He was lonely, stuck in that isolated post, and had asked me to lunch, where he told me how a 1,000-member tribe of fiercely anti-communist nomads from Kyrgyzstan had traveled all the way to Gilgit in the Himalayas in hopes of immigrating to Alaska. Wouldn't that be an amazing story? I asked Richard in the candlelight. The Czech novelist Milan Kundera once said he couldn't stand to think about himself in his 20s when he was an absolute jerk by every point of view. I'm sure many parents of 20-something children would confirm it's an extraordinarily self-involved time. And perhaps all that ego is needed, at least sometimes, to meet the challenge of finding one's place in the world. Even so, I still wince to think of my behavior that night on the roof. Richard switched gears easily, agreeing that my story idea sounded promising, the nomads being such a picturesque and touchingly deluded characters. He could do the story for his newspaper, he said, while I could try to freelance it. The next morning, I booked a flight on a small plane for Richard and his growing entourage, the photographer who'd flown in from Italy, our new Pakistani translator, and me, his mistress apprentice. In Gilgit, we interviewed Rahman Kul, the Kyrgyz tribe's imperious leader, who solemnly asked if we thought he could take his hundreds of goats on the plane with him to the United States. I wandered through the village full of blossoming apricot trees and wide-eyed, smiling children, and I wanted to stay longer. But after just 2 days, we flew back to Peshawar, where Richard told me I'd have to return alone to London. He planned to slip into Afghanistan, disguising himself in robes and turbans, to blend in with a group of mujahideen to continue his reporting on the real news of the rebellion. When I hinted that I'd like to come along, he looked at me with what seemed like sadness and shook his head no. I wouldn't be able to protect you, he said. I nodded, returning his sad look, even as I knew we were both fibbing. He didn't want to be encumbered. Well, despite all my talk of aspiring to cover foreign wars, when it came down to it, at least just then, I was more than half relieved by the excuse to skip the goat meat dinners and the threats of Soviet airstrikes. Back at Richard's flat, I realized I couldn't bear to face the Newsweek bureau chief again. So I hung out in limbo, sleeping in Richard's bed, writing in my journal, taking long walks and typing up notes for what I'd hoped would be a magazine story on the nomads. All this was just fine until Richard's planned week with the Mujahideen turned into 2. Then he called from Peshawar with a vague update. He'd need a few days to follow his story, and then he might have to go to Rome. He'd let me know, he said, but he didn't. I had no idea if Richard had been serious in Islamabad with his talk about babies, But I've been thinking more pragmatically about my own prospects, my apparent lack of stick-to-itiveness, and how much work it would take to go back home and cover news with no guarantee it would lead me back overseas. As much as I loved journalism and believed I was getting good at it, I was sure I'd never be as talented as Richard. But as his wife, I'd be able to keep doing it under pretty optimal circumstances. I wouldn't have to put up with jerky bosses like the Newsweek bureau chief, and I'd be free to be creative as long as I avoided having those babies. Alone in Richard's flat, I fantasized about our future together, even as a small, still functioning part of my brain registered that another week had gone by and I had no idea when he planned to return. 2 more days passed. It rained constantly. I barely left the flat, eating cheese and crackers for dinner and staying close to the phone. No call. On the third afternoon, a letter addressed to Richard dropped through the mail slot. The return address was the Newsweek office in New York, so I figured correctly it was from Richard's friend, my editor. I didn't hesitate to slide my fingernail under the seal. What I read made me wish I hadn't. The editor began by scolding Richard for having asked him to assign me to a story in Ireland so he could host one of his girlfriends in London in my absence. He went on to rail about how I'd abandoned the internship, warning his friend against getting more involved with such an opportunistic groupie. I blinked hard and read that phrase again. It was impossible that he meant me. Breathing shallowly, I found a little glue stick to reseal the envelope. I checked the clock, calculating that Sarah would just be coming to work in New York City. Lying with a cup of coffee and a patch of sunlight on the Pakistani rug in Richard's living room, I called her, at Richard's expense, to tell her about the photograph of that I'd found of a redhead girlfriend of his, and the letter from an editor. You poor thing, Sarah said immediately. But then she said something that immediately made sense. I don't think you really wanted to marry him, did you? It sounds more like you wanted to be him. I studied the dust motes rising from the carpet. I recognized that what she said was just a slightly more diplomatic version of opportunistic groupie. Still, Sarah helped me see what I had to do next. 3 days later, Richard finally returned. I met him at the airport with a long embrace, but in the cab ride back to the flat, I told him I planned to leave London the next week. I'm going to take your advice and start over at a small paper, I said. If Richard was surprised, he didn't show it. He said I was doing the right thing career-wise, adding nothing about what it meant for our supposed relationship. When the day came, he chivalrously accompanied me to the airport and insisted on waiting with me through my flight's 4-hour delay. For most of that time, he kept his arm around me as I snuffled into his shirt, overwhelmed by feelings of failure, loss, and rage. Everyone had been against me, the bureau chief, Richard, my Newsweek boss. What had I done to deserve that? This is how I was thinking then, if you could call it thinking, more like not thinking, in my conviction that I had no share of the blame for the ruin of that internship and the quasi-love affair. Not until many years later could I see my part in tearing it all down. Like the way I hadn't bothered to tell the New York editor who had hired me, my former champion, that I was going AWOL to Pakistan, and the look on Richard's face during that candlelight dinner after I switched the topic from babies to Kyrgyz nomads. No wonder the Newsweek editor had been so mad. No wonder Richard and I would never have lasted a month had we gone ahead and gotten married. Once again, I was able to see things more clearly, but it distressed me to realize how blindly I'd been moving through the world. And that is that. So happy to take your questions.
So I want to kick it off. So you were talking about, being young and at Newsweek and mistakes and learning, from them. You had a lot going on when you started at the San Jose Mercury and this case with Judy Singer, and a lot of things occurred in that first year. So, I remember reading an excerpt from like the first chapter, the one chapter, and getting that lawsuit. And I mean, how did you feel? I mean, there was the fear of getting fired and the lawsuit, and what did you get from all of that?
Well, I should probably explain the lawsuit. This book is a lot about mistakes and how to maybe bounce back from them and learn from them and try to be stronger than before. But I almost didn't. In my very first year at the San Jose Mercury News, where I was doing exactly what Richard advised me and covering a beat and being at a smaller paper, that's when I met Judy Singer. And at the time, she was the wife of a man who was on trial for orchestrating the murder of her former husband. And as I mentioned before, she was not charged with any crime, but there was something about her that was so intriguing and mysterious. It was obvious that she was smarter than her second husband. Everybody sort of knew that, and everybody was sort of suspicious about her. That should have made me even more careful than I was. And the prosecutor kept saying, we reporters would ask the prosecutor, don't you think Judy was involved? Didn't she know of the murder? And he would just say, there's not a shred of evidence. But alas, in the story on his concluding argument, I wrote that he had said that Judy and Howard Singer, and Judy and Robert Singer had plotted the murder of Howard Whitkin, which he never said. And the mistake went into the paper, it got right by the copy editor, nobody saw it. It was just this little 2 words, two little extra words. But Judy saw it and she asked for a correction. And after that, she sued me in the newspaper for $11 million. And I came very close to being fired at that point. My editors really, they liked me. I mean, I would do stories that landed on the front page. I was kind of a rule breaker, so I didn't just cover the incremental stories in each criminal trial. I would write these big dramatic stories, the backstories of the cases, and they liked that. So they really encouraged me that I had been making other mistakes before I made that big mistake. And so that was really, I guess, the mistake that became the turning point in my whole life, because I knew that if I wanted to have this career that I loved, I had to figure out why this was happening, why I kept screwing things up. I mean, at that point, I think it was beyond your average early 20s screwing up kind of thing. I was reckless. I was very careless. So
Someone just asked, could you talk more about the parallels between your mother and Judy and how that affected you?
this is a bit of a sensitive issue in my family, as you can imagine. My mother was my closest friend for much of my life and much of my adult life, and I really was close and adored her. And she was also the kind of a matriarch for our family, so she has many loyal followers. But she was in a situation where, like Judy, she was also putting on a front, pretending that everything was great and that she was a perfect mother, and we had no problems in our family, where really there was a, a lot of dysfunctional stuff going on. My dad was an alcoholic, and he used to beat up on my brothers, and she kept all of that secret. And so when you ask about parallels between my mother and Judy, I think the strongest one was that both of these women were keeping really devastating secrets. Uh, in Judy's case, obviously, it was far more serious, but in my mother's case, it was also very damaging. We all felt very sorry for her, um, and so we were all very loyal to her. But her silence was a form of complicity, and it was continuing. It caused a lot of harm to my brothers. So that was a hard thing. I had to separate from that, and then we were close again. But I had to find my own way of being more honest in the world and being more honest with her.
We had another question. A psychic was used by the prosecution. What is your opinion of psychics?
I'm very, personally, I'm a little skeptical of them, but if you read about what this particular psychic said to the prosecutors, it's quite astounding. She, looking back on it, having the tape of their conversation and and then following the case forward, I was stunned by how much she got right, almost inadvertently. I don't think she even knew how much she got right. So it would be hard for me to totally discredit psychics. I'm probably, I don't know what's going on there, but she called a lot of things very clearly.
One of the themes in your book is narcissism. So, what do you think is the difference between healthy and unhealthy narcissism?
Yeah, I think that really became more and more the theme of the book, and something that I really enjoyed exploring, because I'm proud of myself that I was able to pick myself up off the floor and kind of reconstruct my life after this happened. And I think that that was some degree of healthy narcissism. You have to believe in yourself, right? You have to believe there's something worth rehabilitating. And I think my parents, including my mother, really gave me that faith in myself. They thought all their kids were stars. I have three siblings who are all doctors. We live in a very, it was a very Jewish, overachieving, education, valuing education kind of family. And they gave each of us a sense that we were special and out to do great things. So that I think was a form of healthy narcissism for me. But I also think that, that's why I read you that chapter about Richard. I also think that at that point, I had some unhealthy narcissism going on. And I do believe that that was also part of my problem, in that I wasn't working hard enough to pay attention to the mistakes I was making, which was causing problems for everybody and really jeopardizing my colleagues that I worked with at the paper. I wasn't thinking about them. I was just thinking, oh, I don't know. On some level, I must have been thinking the copy editor will catch it, or it doesn't matter. It's just but I wasn't stopping myself to be more careful. So, and I think that on a spectrum, if you're going along on that continuum, the most unhealthy kind of narcissism is what Judy Singer represented, because I think that in her case, it was a kind of just a blindness to the harm that she was doing in the world. She wanted so much to believe that she was perfect, and that she was raising funds for the temple. She was a chapter president of Hadassah. That she would build herself up with other people's adoration, but she wasn't really looking at the damage that she was doing to even the people closest to her. And it was such a tragedy. I mean, even to her children, she was a really destructive force.
Someone asked, do you think your father would have reformed sooner if your mother would have taken a stronger stance?
Yeah, I mean, that's the tragedy of our family, that she didn't stand up to him until the very, very end. When she was 89, she finally said, "I'm not going to live with you while you keep drinking," and it was quite a dramatic. She was dying of cancer at the time, and I think she had nothing left to lose in her mind. So she finally was honest with him and was honest with the world. She didn't want to, she didn't want to air her dirty laundry, but I think at the end it became too much. But everybody in, my siblings and I have had this talk quite a lot. Like, how could she have stood up to him? Because in those days, again, many wives were so completely dependent on their husbands, that I think she was, I mean, I feel some compassion for how terrified she must have been to have struck out on her own as a single mom, right? But he was so devoted to her that there's no doubt in my mind, if she'd have stood up to him earlier about his drinking, that he would have shaped up, because he did in a minute. When he was so scared of losing her that when she finally did, he stopped drinking right away.
Judy asked, how did your family feel about your career choice?
Um, for years, until when that Pulitzer, my father would say, "I bet you $1 you're going to end up in medical school," because the three, he was a doctor, his father was a doctor, and my three siblings were all doctors. I think the genes kind of ran out because I was the youngest of my siblings, but they they came around to it. Let's once I was making them proud. I mean, I don't think they were too excited when I almost got fired. I mean, I was kind of bouncing around the world, and they were worried about my safety, and they were worried if I was ever going to be able to support myself. They were more worried than that. They were worried that I would never find a husband, right? If I were going to be a foreign correspondent, what kind of husband could I possibly find? And how could I ever be married to a nice Jewish doctor or lawyer? And then they felt the same way about my husband because he was not their idea of the perfect husband, the kind of husband they expected. He was unemployed when I met him.
So I had a question because you and I had spoke earlier, and you were saying that you just spoke to a group in Great Britain about your ADHD. And something I've been noticing from some of our other events, a book can seem one way on the outside. We're talking about mothers and murderers, but then there's always these different themes that come out. And one of them is your ADHD. So how do you think that affected what happened with the lawsuit and at the San Jose Mercury and just kind of your career path? Like, how do you think your ADHD has affected you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ADHD is a kind of a subtle theme of the book, but I've written 3 books about ADHD and didn't really see this as an ADHD book. I was diagnosed at 48 after my son was diagnosed at age 9. And this is quite common that parents have found out that they have the disorder after they've seen a child struggling, because it's much more on the radar now. When I was going to school, boys were diagnosed with ADHD, but girls never were. Um, I think definitely it had a role in the kind of job that I looked for, because I wouldn't have wanted to be making these mistakes as a doctor, obviously. And I had to kind of work that out. Luckily, I didn't do that much damage by the mistakes that I did make. But I think the novelty, the excitement, and just the adventure of reporting really called to me. And people with ADHD seek these situations of high stimulation and lots of new things. So it worked out really well for me being a reporter.
So a couple other things were feminism and your ambition. And how do you think that impacted your relationship with your mother and then your relationship with Judy?
I think that was also a theme of the book, because it took place at a time, I don't know how many of you have read or heard of the book Backlash, that lays out what was happening in the early 1980s. After we made all this progress as women in the 1970s, there was Roe versus Wade, there was Ms. Magazine, women were getting into grad schools. There was so much going on for feminism. And then Ronald Reagan was elected, 1980, took office in 81. And all of a sudden we were hearing more about family values. Phyllis Schlafly was out there campaigning against the ERA. It was really a dramatic kind of a time when I think that women who wanted to be out in the workforce and women who were invested mostly in their identity as mothers were pitted against each other in various ways. A wonderful TV show I can recommend is Mrs. America, which is about Phyllis Schlafly, that just came out, that really talks about those times. But if you look back, I don't think there's ever been a time when daughters were suddenly had suddenly so many different motives than their mothers. A time when we weren't just following the generations before us. It was something so new that women were told in the 70s that we could go out and do anything, right? And I think for my mother, reading Betty Friedan, it was almost painful, because she realized that she could have had such a different life. She was a very smart woman, but her whole identity was wife and mother, and she became a teacher in her later years. But I think she was looking at me, and there was almost a certain kind of a jealousy or a competition or resentment even, that I could be so free and I wouldn't have to be dependent on a man and take anything that they would throw at me. So all of that was really complicated. And as adults, my mother and I talked about this quite a lot. It was really, really interesting to have those conversations with her.
Sue asked, do you care to comment on how the harmfulness of extreme narcissism seems to have become something that a large portion of the country doesn't recognize?
Wow, that's an interesting question, because I think I don't want to veer into politics at this point too much, but I think we've had an example of somebody who's been dubbed a narcissist, who has arguably put his interests above the country's. This could be a whole other conversation, but I think people are recognizing the damage that narcissism can do as maybe never before. And there've been a lot of books about narcissism recently, um, that have raised these questions. You know what I find very interesting about this disorder is, I had some talks with a man, a psychologist, who wrote a wonderful book about narcissism, and it became clear to me that you sometimes think of narcissists as happy, right? Because they're always bragging about their accomplishments and how great they are. So the misunderstanding is that these people really think they're great. Whereas for most narcissists, it arises out of a wound in childhood where they were rejected. They didn't, they didn't get the recognition that they needed at that critical time. And so they're looking for it for the rest of their lives and constantly telling people how wonderful they are. Um, there's been a lot of talk about about Donald Trump, mainly by his niece, that his father was very cruel to him and very dismissive of him, and that part of his need for approval and adulation might be that he's seeking it from his dad.
I kind of want to switch gears a little bit, and could you maybe kind of talk about some of the Jewish themes that are in your book?
Um, it's interesting because so many of the characters in the book were Jewish, not just Judy and Howard and Bob Singer, and Judaism was so important to them, at least in its outward aspects. But the person I became closest to in the trial was the defense attorney for the triggerman. His name was Brian Scheckmeister, and he and I used to talk all the time about how this has got to be a book. This case is really incredible. And he was the one who at first gave me all these arrest reports and a lot of the documents I needed to get started. And one of the things he said really, really struck me when we were just watching the first trial take place, and he was personally furious at Bob Singer for hiring these two goons, these two doofuses, and ruining their lives as well as destroying Howard and his children. And he pointed to part of the Talmud where it says that persuading somebody else to kill is worse than killing yourself, as being the murderer yourself, because you're destroying these other lives. And that really stuck with me. So I suppose that was one theme. I think another theme is just, there's something about Jewish mothers, and how, and having become one myself, I've really realized it. I've embodied it completely. I mean, how much I think there's a special way in which we put our children on pedestals, like Judy calling her son the little Messiah. That really struck me.
Do you have anything that you're working on currently that you can tell us about?
Right now, I've gone back to daily, weekly reporting just for the time being. This book took a lot out of me, and so I've been writing stories for the Washington Post and health stories, reporting on the coronavirus, and doing some education stories, and writing about climate change, which is a big interest of mine. And as I mentioned before, I also do occasional talks about ADHD, so I'm continuing with that. And anybody who has, I'll tell you something interesting is that there's one theory that uh, many Jewish families end up having some form of ADHD in their family because it's so common in migrants, because of that urge for novelty and that the shpilkas, that we're restless and we have the guts to explore new worlds. So I keep finding Jewish families where ADHD is a special problem. So there's that crossover thing too. But anyway, I have a Facebook page in my name, just Katherine Ellison, where I keep up to date with news about ADHD. So if anybody finds that to be an issue, please check in with me.
We just had another question pop up. Why was Judy so cruel to her daughter? Can you attribute Judy's problems to her own upbringing?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that really, really struck me as when I mentioned that I felt like Judy was becoming more like Hannibal Lecter. As I got to know her and interviewed her daughter, who was adopted, I found out, it was one more secret that she was hiding. I mean, she just seemed like this perfect mother doing everything for her children, but she was terribly mistreating her daughter. And I think Judy was mistreated as a child. And those kinds of things, if you don't understand them, if you don't take the time to be honest with yourself and figure out where you're hurting, those kinds of things can go on for generations. I guess another theme of this book is really how important psychotherapy can be. I was really lucky to find a wonderful psychiatrist who I never ever would have found had I not made that horrible mistake. So that mistake was in a way a gift to me. Um, and I really would, for anybody who's had child abuse in their family, it's a wonderful thing to be able to really understand it and get over that wound, so you don't make the same terrible mistakes with your own family. And sometimes it's only that deep looking at yourself that can get you past that.
We had another question. She hasn't read the book yet, but she was wondering, where was Judy in jail and how cushy or how severe was it? And do you think she's reformed now?
How pushy or how severe? I might need to understand that a little bit
Like
better.
cushy, was it like
Oh,
minimum security,
cushy.
maximum security? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was not cushy at all. I mean, here's somebody who grew up really in luxury and always treated herself very well. She was in maximum security prison for women in eastern southeastern California, near Chowchilla, um, and she was in a room with seven other women for a time. It was terribly overcrowded. This prison, it wasn't at times it wasn't safe, and despite all of that, she was the first woman to be bat mitzvahed. She went ahead and got bat mitzvahed. She's really a character. And she was part of there was a sisterhood in the prison. So she found the other two or three Jewish ladies there. Um, Somebody who knew her then recently got in contact with me, another Jewish lady who was a prisoner for a couple of years after embezzling some funds. And so many people who met Judy Singer and come to know her come away like I did, like, oh my God, like they just want to talk to somebody about her. So I just had that interesting conversation with the ex-embezzler recently. But is she reformed? She's never fully taken responsibility for the murder, which ended up as such a tragedy for her children, as I write about in the book, because they lived with, I think that was one of the worst things that she did to them, was to continue to lie. And that has such a corrosive effect on your mental health. If at any point she'd come out and just been straight with them, if it really was because she was desperate to protect them, that she felt that her first husband wasn't safe, whatever reason she had, it would have been so much better for her to actually say what happened than continue lying. So I wouldn't say she's completely reformed, no.
Has your mom read the book? And what does your mom and what does Judy think of the books?
Well, unfortunately, my mother passed away in 2017. And frankly, I think that what my mom's reaction to the book might have been was one of the things that made writing the book so hard for me. I guess I had to write it in a certain way, and I was only able to really face the fact of this parallel after both my parents died, and then it was like this book, which was so hard for me to write, just flew by after that. So I didn't want to disturb them, even though I had some anger about the situation that lasted for so long. Um, I was a loyal daughter, and I think that was really getting in the way of writing that. Judy, I'm sure, has read the book and didn't like it. I, I was at her parole hearing, and that was where I guess our friendship ended because she tried to not let me attend it. So I'm not high on her Rosh Hashanah card list anymore.
Are there any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank Katherine Ellison for joining us from California for our event, Mothers and Murderers. And if you are interested in purchasing it, you can get it online. It's currently for sale at Barnes& Noble on Monroe Street. So be sure to head over there and say hi to them and look for our display. And like Katherine said, she does have her Facebook. And Katherine, I believe you have a website too, correct?
I do, and you can contact me through my website. I love to get messages, love to hear what you thought of the book. It's just www.katherineellison.com.
So you can find a lot more about her books there, about this case in particular. I know I was on it when I first read the excerpt, and I was trying to Google more information until we got the book. So yeah, so be sure to visit her Facebook, her website to get more information. Get her book because it's a book festival. That's what we want. I do have signed book plates, so registration at jewishtoledo.org if you want a book plate from Katherine also. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening to talk to Katherine. And thank you, Katherine, for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Stay safe, you guys. Okay.
Thank you. You too. Stay safe, everyone. We'll see you at the next event.